And for us now, what we're seeing is that we're still seeing, even in our days at Call of Duty and things like that, we see, brand integrations that failed because it was hard to value their contribution, right? Things like that. And we really think that this concept of Web3 with gaming unlocks a lot of really interesting value. So it unlocks the ability for new content deals. How do you kind of, your participation in the game, you can actually become entrepreneurial in. And that's, again, as a player, but it could also be as an esports team or an influencer or a brand or an artist or musician, whatever. And I think that becomes really powerful. And so we kind of view this next, kind of world of Web3 really around two things. One is the ability for anyone to kind of come into these game economies and participate directly, but also it allows new gameplay. And I think that's what we've been very excited to see.
Hey everybody, Tanner here with WAGMI Ventures. On today's podcast, we have John Linden, CEO of Mythical Games. For anyone who's new, this is the WAGMI Ventures podcast, where we do company snapshots with interesting founders from across Web3. Check out wagmiventures.io to learn more about the syndicate behind the podcast. But for now, let's get into it with John from Mythical Games. All right. Hey, everybody. I'm here with John Linden, CEO of Mythical Games. John, how's it going today?
Good. Thanks for having me. It's ready to talk about what's going on in our world.
Yeah, I'm excited to chat. Thank you so much for the time. So I'd love to, pretty much always like to start just a little bit about kind of your story and how you got to what you're working on with Mythical Games.
Yeah, definitely. So like I said, I've been in the video game industry for a long time now. I started my career at Activision Blizzard. I was one of the studio heads in the Call of Duty franchise. So really started off in kind of big PC console games. We went through some really fun times with that game, obviously, is one of the biggest games in the world. And that's really kind of cut my teeth in that world. And, after that, really started thinking about what comes next. And we were, we played around with the Skylanders franchise. We did kind of this mobile game to where we actually sold physical packs of cards, similar to like Pokemon or Yu-Gi-Oh! And all that. And actually these cards you could scan with your iPhone or iPad and become secure digital assets. So it was fun, early innovation. I mean, this was back in 2014. And, really kind of got hooked into, this concept of kind of physical to digital or secure digital assets. Ended up leaving Activision and started a mobile game company called Seismic Games. And kind of through Seismic Games, we did a series of games there. The biggest one was a game called Marvel Strike Force, which I think it's still a top 25 game on mobile, even 5 or 6 years later, which is awesome. And they ended up selling that company to Niantic. And we were actually exploring some early Web3 stuff at Seismic, thinking through a lot of these challenges. The things we've seen this world where stakeholders are huge now, right? Suddenly it's no longer kind of game developer, game publisher, consumer. Now we suddenly had groups like, esports and influencers and brands and artists and musicians and players all wanting to kind of be entrepreneurial within these game worlds. So when we sold to Niantic, I kind of decided, hey, we gotta jump into this. So I called a few of my kind of ex-colleagues from Activision and really started exploring what it became Mythical Games. But our focus really at Mythical from day one was really about how do we use the concepts of ownership and how do we kind of shift these concepts to where players can actually own these assets and be part of this ecosystem. How does that affect stakeholders? How does that affect ownership? How does that affect gameplay? So that was really kind of our genesis of Mythical. And, at the same time, these projects like CryptoKitties came out and started seeing the really interesting value behind, what we call now Web3 and how that could affect game assets. So we were pretty early on. We kind of picked up blockchain in 2018 and been building heavily ever since.
Yeah, I love it. So for those who aren't familiar, could you just talk a little bit about Mythical Games, what you guys are up to?
Yeah, definitely. So here at Mythical, we've been building what we call the Mythical platform. So for us, it's a blockchain tech that's really made for gaming, right? It's a marketplace tech that's really made for gaming. And then really all the types of principles and pieces to let game developers really take these new sets of tools and be able to really integrate deep gameplay around concepts like NFTs. And that's really kind of our main focus. We kind of announced our first 4 games that are kind of being built on the platform with Blanco's Block Party, which is out now in early access and actually moving to Epic Game Store, which is exciting. We announced a game called NFL Rivals, a partnership with the NFL and the NFL Players Association for a new game. We have a game called Nitro Nation, which is kind of an existing franchise, mobile franchise, a racing title. I think they had 75 million installs in that franchise. So we've been working with that developer called Creative Mobile on how do they kind of re-architect new gameplay based on this concept of ownership. And then we have a fourth game called Epic Spell Wars, which is kind of a very unique, kind of quirky trading card game that we've been working with a company called Cryptozoic on kind of bringing out kind of their view of NFTs and trading card games.
Yeah, super interesting. So you kind of touched on this a little bit, but I'd love to kind of zoom out on blockchain gaming in general. I'd love to hear your perspective on just kind of where we've been, where we're going, and where Mythical Games sort of fits into all this activity. Because blockchain gaming is just one of the more interesting spaces, right?
That's a great question. So I think, it's really interesting watching where it's gone. There's been a lot of really kind of what I call academic experiments so far, and I think some of them are interesting and some of them have been less interesting, to be real honest. But I think, we've really focused heavily around the asset side, right? We really think that that's where the value is going to be for gamers. That's where the value is for stakeholders that are wanting to be part of these games, a little bit more than the individual game token. And the reason for that is that, we've been in these economies for a long time. We've been very fortunate to work on economies that even have lasted a decade. But at some point, a single game currency will slow in demand, right? And I think the idea around some of these tokenized currencies, single game tokenized currencies is very academic right now. I think we'll see that kind of fall away. But I think we're going to see more and more utilization around the concepts of, what we call NFTs, right? Around kind of these digital assets and what you can do in the game and how do you affect gameplay. So we've really been thinking a lot about that. We've shied away from the tokenized currencies. We do think there's a place for like ecosystem tokens across multiple games or across, a developer or publisher or something like that. But, we've really focused very, very heavily on the digital assets themselves.
Yeah, definitely. So you touched on this already with NFTs, but I'm curious more about what is unlocked, especially given your extensive history in gaming, right? Like, what is unlocked in detail? Because you've already mentioned NFTs, but what are some of the specifics around what is unlocked in Web3 when you put games on the blockchain?
Yeah, definitely. So for us, what we think is interesting is if we kind of look at the game industry over the last 15, 20 years, it feels like there was two massive pivots that just changed gaming pretty heavily. The first one was frankly free to play on mobile, right? That was we kind of call it the democratization of game access, right? And as soon as that became democratized, basically we went from 100 million gamers around the world to nearly 4 billion gamers today. So that was a huge shift in games that happened. And then frankly, the second one we saw was kind of the concepts of platforms like Roblox and Minecraft and all these kind of content creation platforms. And what we saw there happen is basically we saw this democratization of game content, right? Anybody could come in. We started seeing brands enter the space and esports teams enter in the space and influencers enter in the space to create content into these worlds. So we ended up seeing kind of this massive amount of content, more so than any one studio could ever make for a game. And that was a huge shift we saw as well. And for us now, what we're seeing is that we're still seeing, even in our days at Call of Duty and things like that, we see, brand integrations that failed because it was hard to value their contribution, right? Things like that. And we really think that this concept of Web3 with gaming unlocks a lot of really interesting value. So it unlocks the ability for, new content deals. How do you kind of, your participation in the game, you can actually become entrepreneurial in. And that's, again, as a player, but it could also be as an esports team or an influencer or a brand or an artist or musician, whatever. And I think that becomes really powerful. And so we kind of view this next, kind of world of Web3 really around two things. One is the ability for anyone to kind of come into these game economies and participate directly, but also it allows new gameplay. And I think that's what we've been very excited to see. I think at the same time as we've seen, obviously the world has become very a collector world, right? We've been designing games on mobile for kind of these inflationary economies, while, the sneakerhead culture is kind of taking over consumer behaviors. And we're also seeing a Gen Z audience now that their digital identity is as important as anything physical they have. I have two daughters, one in college and one in high school, and their Spotify playlist digitally is as important as my, cassette and CD player collection back in the day. And I think that's what we're seeing happen. And I think what happens when you start adding ownership into these assets is they feel like they can show off that, right? And I think there's a lot of misconceptions of what ownership of digital assets mean. But I do think what we're seeing is we're going to see more and more people that really, like the concept of, hey, I do own this. I can kind of take this. I can show this off. I can move it around. I have some form of transfer or some form of ownership around this particular digital object.
Yeah, super interesting. I'm curious about unique challenges specific to building companies like Mythical Games, especially, as distinct from the types of companies and studios you've worked with in the past. Like, what's unique and how have you solved for some of those challenges?
Yeah, so I think, one of our kind of superpowers here at Mythical has also been one of our curses here at Mythical too, is that we're really kind of almost taking three different industries to merge together to create this new economy, right? So you have kind of gaming, you have some form of fintech or marketplace tech, and then you have blockchain, right? Web3. And they all have, common principles, but they also have conflicting principles in certain ways too. And I think it's really interesting to kind of being able to blend those together to create a new economy is really, really fascinating. And I think we've really leaned heavier on the gaming side overall. We've really thought through things like even a marketplace tech, right? There's a lot of activity goes through things like OpenSea and groups like that, but it's pretty much just it's a pretty bare bones functionality, right? There's not a lot of market making. There's not a lot of liquidity patterns. There's not the ability to bundle as easily and break that up. But more importantly, there's not the intelligence behind it. So what we've seen is, like in free-to-play mobile, really the studios that kind of dominated free-to-play mobile and did it well were those studios that actually could take gameplay data, right, and be able to understand that using machine learning models and these neural nets and stuff like that to really predict what do you put in the economy next, right? What matters to the players in real time, and what do we want to kind of pivot that game to keep them in the game? And those are the companies that really kind of dominate the space. And I think what we're going to start seeing now is we have all these new vectors of information with Web3, right? We have sales velocities and burn rates and what do consumers economically value a particular asset at in real time. And I think it's less about these floors and things like that you're seeing in the PFP communities, and more about just, where are players going? And I think the companies that can actually take that intelligence and help predict, great, what do we put in the economy next? What do we put it at? What pricing and what scarcity? What pricing to balance a primary and secondary economy? That's where the companies that are going to excel and have leverage over other companies. And we're going to see a lot of new functionality come out of that. So I think that's really, really exciting for us. I think we've also seen some really awesome gameplay changes, things that actually when you have perceived value from a consumer, you can kind of change gameplay patterns and you can kind of reward people and let them have new ways to experience an online world.
Yeah, super interesting. I want to take a step back really quick to ask about, because it's tough to read about, or it's hard to miss about Mythical Games that you raised a lot of money. And I imagine a big part of that is hiring people, and it seems like one of your superpowers is building a really excellent team. So I'm curious for those listeners who are building, just any advice you might have or any thoughts you might have on hiring, actually.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's probably one of our most proud assets. I put my team up against anybody, not only in Web3, but I'd put my team up against anybody in gaming at this point. And I think that's the real key, is to really make sure you understand the problem you're trying to create, right? And I think for us, we didn't start off as a blockchain project that kind of said, what do we do with this? Oh, let's get into gaming, which a lot of them have kind of pivoted into. We've really come about it the other way. We've come from the gaming industry saying, hey, how do we use this cool blockchain tech and these principles of Web3 to really further gaming? And I think that's what we've really done a lot here at the company. We have some just amazing people that have joined as my co-founders. Jamie Jackson, he was another fellow studio head at Activision Blizzard, to where I was more on the Call of Duty side. He was on the DJ Hero, DJ Hero, Guitar Hero side. Rudy Koch used to be a producer for me on Call of Duty. And then he went to, he was at Blizzard for a long time working on World of Warcraft. And we saw these challenges firsthand. We've seen gray markets in video games forever, right? And there's the consumers want that ability, but sometimes it can conflict with what the game developers want. And so I think kind of building these tools into the games and giving game developers the ability to build gameplay around this and be part of that transaction, as well as letting consumers be safe, has been really, really powerful. And I think we've surrounded ourselves with people that really understand the gaming side. And I think honestly, we maybe have indexed a little too heavy. I'd say sometimes people are like, well, we're not quite Web3 enough. And that's true. We're a little Web 2.5 right now. But, I think at the end of the day, everything we do is really to focus on kind of building a good game experience, changing gameplays, adding utility. And I think you're seeing the rest of the world start to really focus around that. That's been the key word of the last year has been utility, utility, utility. And I think we started with utility, which is great.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. I'm curious about, you had mentioned, we had a chance to chat briefly right before we started recording here, and you mentioned a project with the NFL. Could you talk a little bit more about that project with the NFL?
Yeah, NFL is interesting. Sports in particular, I think we're going to continue to see dominate kind of this collectible space, and I think a couple of reasons for that. One is that, sports collectibles on the physical side is a great analogy to what a lot of people are trying to do digitally. And I think, honestly, the other thing that's been exciting is watching, sports has been pretty dormant, honestly, in the video game world for a while. You had a couple people that were really dominating the space. Nobody else was really trying to jump into these new franchises. And I think the concept now of what you can do with collectability, and frankly, what happens when you change fan engagement, you can suddenly have a brand new opportunity. And I think that was what was exciting about working with NFL. We went to the NFL and talked to them and said, hey, look, we're not trying to recreate Madden, right? You already have a franchise that does that hardcore simulation game, and that's great. They've been around for 30-something years. What we were wanting to do is how do we take this new concept of these digital collectibles and how can you change that fan engagement experience of how people can, experience the league? How can they experience the teams? And how can they experience, kind of interacting with players themselves? And I think that was really kind of what drove our deal with the NFL. We've had a lot of other sports leagues, reaching out, wanting to do something similar. And we've really kind of come up with a model we're excited about. We're actually going to be showing a lot more of the games soon, which we're excited. We almost have the approvals to show the game, which is awesome. And, I think our view is that I think when people see the game, they're going to see a different style of game, right? So one thing we've done is with the NFL Rivals game, we've really gone into a very accessible game. We want something that people can play in a couple minutes, not a big, huge learning curve, but just kind of this arcadey style, bringing kind of throwbacks to games we loved, growing up too, like NFL Blitz and NBA Jam and even some of the early Madden stuff, back in the day. We want to bring kind of that arcade style back, but more importantly, we want to bring new ways to play and interact, right? So how you can collect these player collectibles, how you can now collect a team collectible, and the team almost becomes a tokenized guild, right? So now there's two ways to play this game. I could come in as a free-to-play player and collect my players and level them up and upgrade them and compete. Or I can come in as a team, kind of on the team management side, and I can grab a team NFT, and now I go recruit the best players in this game to play for my team now. And now I'm on kind of the management side versus on the player side. And we think those are types of things that are really exciting. We'll probably be announcing, and it's not quite ready to do it yet, but there's going to be new ways of what these NFTs can do, right? And how you can manipulate them, and how you can, how players themselves, the NFL players, might be able to be involved with the game itself. And you can now kind of interact as a fan with the players. You can interact with the team while you're playing this kind of this fun arcade style game.
Yeah, I love it. I'm excited to hear more as the weeks and months progress. It sounds really exciting.
Yeah, it's gonna be good, and we're definitely queuing up for we're in this for the long haul. We've signed a multi-year contract with the NFL. We want to be around building this franchise out, and I think we're also working very heavily with not only the NFL but also the NFL Players Association, as well as all 32 teams we've now been working with, and really trying to figure out how do we kind of change that engagement and really have this kind of big accessible product that the fans can get involved with.
Love it. Yeah. So I read a little bit about you guys building an EVM compatible chain in anticipation of the merge. So we're recording this on Tuesday, September 13th. So the merge is right around the corner. Could you talk a little bit about that? Yeah.
Yeah. So we haven't announced this fully yet, but we have dropped kind of hints. We started off in 2018, and one of the big principles we saw in 2018 was we weren't real big on these proof of work networks for a couple reasons, honestly. One, they're really confusing. A lot of people didn't understand what these gas fees are. It wasn't a normal construct that people, in particular gamers, understood. So early on, we went with a proof of stake network. We partnered up with a company called Block One in 2018, and they had a tech called the OSIO, which was really the first kind of proof of stake network. And even that was pretty confusing. They had these concepts of RAM and CPU, and we really hid all that behind the scenes. So we like the idea of proof of stake just because, if you're selling a $200,000 JPEG of an ape, yeah, you might be willing to pay a $60 gas fee to list it and another $60 gas fee to complete that transaction. But for us, it's really about $10, $20 game assets, right? That's more the price point in a video game. And sure, there'll be some things that'll go for thousands of dollars, but our average price point is in that $10 to $20, $30 range. And the idea of paying a $60 gas fee on everything you do just didn't really work for us. So we started off as a proof of stake network. We've had our own chain that we kind of built on top of that. We added some EVM compatibility on top of that as well. So you could bridge in and out. I could take an item off our chain, put it onto an Ethereum wallet, and suddenly trade it on an OpenSea or a DeFi project or something like that. But we really felt like we wanted to take that to another level. So we've been working for a couple of years now, honestly, on kind of a brand new chain. So it is fully EVM compatible. We'll be rolling this out with the NFL and some of our other projects, and we'll be migrating our other projects over. But I think what's going to be really interesting is that, having this fully EVM chain, we are kind of still focused a little bit on a custodial account to start with. But we want to open that up over time. One thing we've seen is, honestly, players are still transacting very heavily in fiat. For us, about 85% of our revenue is still done in fiat because it's just traditional gamers. Only about 15% are paid in crypto. But basically what this allows us to have a kind of this full EVM chain. People we can add more to it, right? So not only can we have a custodial account, we can have bridges. Eventually we can have non-custodial accounts as players are ready for that. But I think that's one thing we've been very sensitive about is that, players have a tendency to lose their passwords, and we want to make sure we're always protecting gamers at all costs, which is why we start off with a custodial account. The idea of a player losing their private keys or losing their seed phrase and then suddenly losing Zelda, that sounds terrible, right? So we want to make sure we're protecting gamers, but we do want to open up more and more opportunities for players to be able to take control of these accounts over time. So the new EVM chain is coming. We're very excited by the new Mythical chain. And I think we're going to see a lot of really great functionality. It also allows us to do a lot more around testing out some local tokens or some of these other principles around DAOs and DEXs and all that type of stuff.
Yeah, I love it. I think that's a fascinating stat about 85% being transacted in fiat. I mean, I feel like one meme about blockchain gaming is that it could drive, it has really high potential to drive more mainstream adoption of crypto and blockchain projects. And I think that's a really big testament to what you guys are building, that 85% still fiat. I think that's really interesting.
It is. And I think we'll see that. I mean, we've already had 1 million accounts into Blankos. The game's coming to Epic Games Store. So we actually think we can, double, triple, quadruple that potentially over the next, 6 months or so. And I think, like I said, our first game, I think we'll see, millions of players in this thing. And frankly, a lot of them don't even know it's blockchain, and that's by design, just come in, play, transact, and then find this like, wait a second, I can sell this asset? What does that mean? Yeah. At that point, you're starting to introduce them into those concepts. And I think what will happen is we'll end up with, 50 to 100 million players that are playing these games, and they slowly learn about these concepts. They slowly learn about private keys. And that's why we built on blockchain to begin with, is that we really do believe in all these principles of Web3, right? Not only for the players themselves, but also all these interactions, letting artists come in and being able to, set up their own smart contracts or having new smart contracts between players, right? So you can really take a lot of the concepts of gaming, whether it's guilds and clans or it's some type of collaboration, some type of collab between two vendors, and you can really start letting the power go back to the owners of the IP. And I think that gets really, really exciting of where we can go next, right? You're starting to see a lot of things in Fortnite, as an example, a lot of crossovers and collabs. But imagine eventually when those can happen on their own, right? You have two parties that can come up with their own rules and they can lock into a smart contract and everything just goes, right? Those are the things we get really excited about. And that's when we think we start changing gaming permanently.
Yeah. On that note, I'm curious 5 years down the road, if you guys continue to execute, what does the world look like, both with respect to technology and also the gaming experience itself? We've covered this some already, but I'm curious, maybe anchoring around that 5 years. Like, what are you looking down the barrel at over the next 5 years?
That's a great question. I think what we'll see is a lot of really interesting stuff. Frankly, I think we'll see more and more brands and get involved. I think this is, they all are clamoring to be in the attention of consumers and to do it in a very authentic way. So I think we're going to see a lot more crossover. Again, we're starting to see that you see that in Roblox, you see it in all these different things. So I think the concept of what people call metaverse, I think, is going to become real. I think what will happen is there's going to be ways to actually sync games together, right? So our vision of metaverse, and we bought a company last year called Polystream that can basically stream a game from the cloud. And it does it in a very economical way, right? There's been some challenges in the past with cloud streaming technologies, but I think these guys have done it right, and we're excited to have them as part of our portfolio now. But basically what you can start doing now is you can actually stream different games. So let's say you take two different games that can both be streamed in the cloud. Well, you can actually move from game to game. So it's not necessarily a metaverse doesn't have to be one engine. To me, metaverse is an ideology, right? It's the ability to say, hey, you know what? I'm going to move from blankos into the sandbox, right? And when I move into the sandbox, it's going to verify I still own that asset or what assets I do own by the blockchain. And it can even shift that asset. So one of our characters might not be interoperable with that game. It might be compatible with that game, right? So my character turns into a voxel style when I go into sandbox, right? When I come back out of sandbox, I move back into blankos and I shift that same asset has a different kind of persona, right? In our game. But it's a seamless experience for players. So you can literally kind of move from world to world, and Sandbox and Blankos don't have to be the same engine, right? They can be two different companies, two different engines, but you start having this fluid dynamic between them. And I think that's where it gets cool. Not every game will be like that, but I think there's so many amazing IPs that will be able to float from game to game in different ways. So I think those are the types of things that are exciting. But also, again, it's not necessarily about that exact replica moving from game to game. It could be a loyalty item, right? So, hey, I have an Alexander McQueen bag in one game, and then suddenly I'd shift to an Alexander McQueen dragon in another game. And that's a terrible example, but you see what I'm saying? Like, it's the idea of I own this item, and it can shift based on my experience. And that's when we get really, really cool stuff. So I think 5 years from now, that's what we're going to see. We're going to see games interlinked. We're going to see deal flow happening on its own. We're going to see players that figure out how to become entrepreneurial and figure out, hey, I have an idea. And be able to go from I have an idea to actually implement that idea and be part of that ecosystem. To me, that's the plan. That's where we're heading. And I think I think 5 years is the right target for that.
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting vision. So John, two last questions here before we wrap up. I'm curious, what advice would you have for founders building in the Web3 space, founders, builders, company leaders, from your experience over the last 4 years building Mythical games?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'd say the first one is avoid the noise. I think there's a lot of people caught up with chasing the latest project that came out yesterday. And I think it's really about being authentic to what you're trying to solve, right? And I think that's probably our biggest suggestion right now. If we see another ape clone, project, right, I'm gonna scream. It's just like it seems like a lot of people are just jumping on the bandwagon of what worked yesterday. And I think the key is really take this amazing tech, take these amazing principles behind the tech, and build what's right for the world you're trying to build, right? And I think that's a real key thing, And it's hard. I mean, it's definitely hard right now. We've got a lot of this in NFL. They're like, wait a second, that's not a 10,000 drop. There's more than 10,000, right? Well, for our game, that's right. We think this game can get into 10 million plus players. So we're going to design it for what's right there. And it's less about chasing the floor or min-maxing a PFP project. And really, what do you do with these assets? How do you interact? What can the fans do? How do you build loyalty? How do you build community? And ultimately, how do you build long-term value for that project? So to me, that's the biggest advice is don't chase the latest trend that's 24 hours old, but really, really use this powerful tech and ideology to build something new that's right for your project.
Yeah, I love it. Okay, so last question. What are you working on right now, and what's the best way for people to follow along the journey?
Yeah, so we have a couple projects right now. So again, we do have a new chain that we're working on. We have kind of an updated marketplace that we're working on as well. That's really from a lot of our learnings the last few years. We're really working on a lot of advanced liquidity, kind of tech behind that to really let consumers have the power. Blankos obviously is coming to Epic Games Store. We're super excited by that. That took a very long time to get through just because, there's policy changes, things people don't realize. I've seen a couple of people out there like, well, Mythical announced Blankos on Epic Game Store. Every game should be on Epic Game Store. Well, there's challenges there, right? I mean, the first thing that people don't realize is when you want to go on one of these big app stores, whether it's Xbox or I guess Apple and Google don't quite have the same criteria, but the Xbox and Epic Game Store and all that, you have to be rated. So we were like, cool, we've been through ESRB rating before, but we went through ESRB rating with Blankos, and they're like, well, we don't know how to rate a blockchain game, So there's been a lot of those challenges. We've now worked through them. We're working with the ones in Europe. We worked with USK out of Germany. So there's a lot of firsts happening there. And I think hopefully we're opening the doors for everybody else to kind of follow as well on some of this stuff because policies are shifting. So we're excited about Epic Game Store. We're excited to get this game in front of a traditional major game audience. We have an NFL Rivals game. So we're working on kind of this mobile game. We started the pre-sale. The first 2 teams are out on, it's called Rarity League. So the rarityleague.com. You can find those first 2 teams. The other 30 teams, there's 32 teams total, are coming very quickly. And we're going to start showing a lot more of that game too, of what you can do and all that. Obviously we have some big partners involved in that game. So there's a lot of approvals and a lot of kind of coordination, which can take it a little bit slower than a normal project. We're excited about that. And then we also announced a third project called Nitro Nation. So nitronationworldtour.com. And it's going to be an amazing, amazing racing title. And we're going to be showing a lot more of that, probably next month and start building up that community. Because I think that's a community that's already seen 75 million players on the existing franchise. And we're excited to show off what you can do when you have Web3 in a game. It's not just about flipping an asset or watching the floor. It's really about the new gameplay that comes out of that. So those are projects we're super excited about. There'll be a lot more coming. We have a slate 2 of games in the works. But it's going to be a fun couple of years ahead.
Definitely. John, thank you so much for the time. I'm excited to keep watching Mythical Games and really appreciate you taking the time today. Have a great day.
All right. Thank you so much for having me. Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.